Yeah, yeah. Well, my coming to New York was sort of deferred because I was living in Michigan, you know, post-college, and still playing around there. And I was playing with James Carter, and I was playing with a lot of people in Detroit. And I was playing with some, like I was getting, because of association with James and some of those people, I was getting calls. Even Lester Bowie would call me sometimes to do gigs, and I'd fly out to New York and do a gig with him or somewhere, and some other people. So I had a little bit of an inroad into New York, but I waited until, I didn't move to New York until '97. So I was 27, so it was a little bit later, and I moved there with a really steady gig with James. So the energy and stuff was great, and I was really into the scene, but I already knew a number of people. I'd already made some connections from being on the road, from the touring kind of scene and the festival scene. Like I had played here in Monterey, and I played a lot of the festivals and met a lot of musicians. So my entry was relatively smooth, I think, into that intense environment. So it was, you know, I had money, I had resources. It wasn't like, oh, I don't know anybody and I don't know what to do, how to introduce myself. And I had so many of my associates from around Detroit were kind of the guys playing, so it was there was also that. There was I had a little bit of cred, you know, like they would say, oh, this is Craig, you know, and it meant more to be introduced by, you know, those guys to whoever than just be like, hi, I'm Craig, you know, and introduce myself. Something, oh, this is Craig, you know. So I found that really relatively smooth, but it took a while for me to establish maybe my own identity in terms of like all the kinds of things I like to play, because I was doing a lot of electronic music in Detroit. I was doing straight ahead gigs, like more open kind of avant jazz gigs and all kinds of things. But because I was playing with James, I think I was known more for like a straight ahead kind of thing when I first moved to New York. But then I started playing with Roscoe Mitchell, and then that, you know, and then I was doing this kind of jazz techno kind of stuff, drum and bass and all this stuff. And they were like three different identities, and people who knew me from one didn't know that I did the others. And it took a while for that to coalesce, that I was the same, like I could go these different places. So for a couple of years I was just in these compartmentalized scenes, I think, you know, a little bit. But then very quickly it became something where I was starting to get called for people looking for somebody who did all these different things. And then I started playing a lot more in New York as opposed to living in New York and touring, yeah. I think that there was a divergence. I mean, I think there was a certain kind of compartmentalization that is sort of the natural ebb and flow, or sort of the natural dialectic that occurs in this development of the music, you know, like I think, you know, you're this hard bop into this free jazz, and then the advent of kind of this jazz rock into fusion, or jazz funk into fusion, and then those things became such stark styles. And I'm never a style person, like really, I mean, I recognize it in terms of the resulting sound, but once it becomes that way, so the trend was, through the 70s, was this real fusion, and then that was really separate from people who were dealing with acoustic sound. And so once the 80s came around, sort of my generation was a rediscovery of really wanting to deal with acoustic sound. And there wasn't a connection maybe with a certain kind of creativity. So I think it's sort of electronics or of acoustic music. Like, it was a stylized, compartmentalized thing. So I think a lot of people really, it just fell out of fashion. And I think people were afraid of the electronics, because the only references at the time were a certain kind of fusion styling that was actually really interesting, but had fallen out of favor in the face of the new thing. People didn't really have a sense of what to do, so it was like this avoidance, you know, which a lot of people felt. I mean, as much as I was into electronics, like my bass playing friends, and I think it was ultimately a really good thing, was there was a resurgence of acoustic bass players, which was something that had not happened, you know. So I remember going with Reed Anderson, like when we were like in high school, and finding the right mic for him, and him refusing to even use a pickup at that stage. He wanted just to mic his bass and do this whole thing. And it was like a big thing. But I think my sense of electronic music was also informed outside of the jazz realm. So I was aware of sort of new developments in dance music, electronic dance music, and avant-garde electronic music. And then I was also referencing older stuff, more like the Miles kind of 60s, 70s stuff. And that was where I was getting inspiration from. And of course, that's what happened later. But I think there's just a little pocket where it was like this world of guys who were into like Chick Corea Electric Band, and then guys who were into like Wynton, and they kind of didn't cross the thing. And I'm just not a person who was into being compartmentalized. So I always heard the possibility for everything to exist everywhere. So for a while, I think I just was not afraid of electronics, but I didn't do it in the stylistic way of like maybe the way that Fusion was approaching it in the mid to late 80s, you know. Like my whole thing was sort of a throwback, more throw aside and a throwback to like what Zawinul or Herbie or Keith or Chick or whatever, you know. I know Keith probably would be into it, but you know, that was like, I really liked what his approach to like the road stuff. I think it was great. It sounded great because he was dealing with the sound of it, and it, you know, maybe against some aesthetic sensibility, but he was working with it and making music out of it, and it's always informative, you know. Especially that, you know, it's almost like when you don't like something and you're trying to make it work for you, that your creative resolve is tested. You know, it's like I've got to find something here, you know. Craig.